VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And we do thank you for joining us on Crosstalk here on VCY. And friends, if you follow the news, you'll know the debate that's being waged as it pertains to the Federal Reserve. I mean, often the battle is over the setting of interest rates, whether they should be raised or lowered. Well, according to their website, the Federal Reserve says that they are the central bank of the United States. They say it provides the nation with a safe, flexible, and stable monetary financial system. Well, friends, what's been evidenced is the great power and even the control that this institution has. Yet many people are unaware of the origins of the Federal Reserve, their purpose, and where their authority comes from. Our guest today has said you cannot understand what's going wrong in our country without an understanding of the Federal Reserve. So our topic today is the Federal Reserve, what you need to know. Joining us, we welcome back Alex Newman. Many of you know him as an award-winning international freelance journalist. He is an author. He's a researcher, an educator, and a consultant. Senior editor for The New American, co-author of Crimes of the Educators, and author of Deep State, The Invisible Government Behind the Scenes, and also the book Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. Alex is the founder and CEO of Liberty Sentinel. He's a national syndicator of radio and TV programs, including Behind the Deep State, that airs right here on VCY.TV and WVCY Television. Alex, so nice to have you back today.
It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Jim.
So we're going to get down to the nuts and bolts of this here today, the Federal Reserve. But at the outset, some may be with us today who say, hey, I don't understand finances. I don't understand rates. This really has zero interest or impact on my part. Alex, let's first start by telling us why this is such an important topic for us to discuss and why we must grasp a hold of this topic.
Well, thank you again, Jim. And a lot of people don't realize the Federal Reserve is by far the most important economic institution in the country. Its actions affect every one of us. They could bankrupt us all tomorrow. They could crash the economy tomorrow. They have essentially unchecked power over our economic lives, over our savings, over our retirement. And one of the big problems, from a Christian perspective, one of the big problems is that it is based on incredibly unbiblical principles. God talks about honest weights and measures being absolutely necessary. He talks about dishonest weights and measures being an abomination. He talks about usury. And what the Federal Reserve does, and I think people need to understand, too, the Federal Reserve is not actually a federal agency. It's actually a cartel of private banks that operates with some nexus to the federal government. And it also doesn't have reserves. But this is an institution that basically holds the economic lives of everybody in its hands. It is totally out of control. It is totally unaccountable. And it actually has set up a system that is inevitably going to self-destruct. There are different ways that it could self-destruct. There are different timelines on which it could self-destruct, but it will inevitably self-destruct. And I say that with no hesitation at all. If we continue on the current trajectory, it will self-destruct, and it'll take the U.S. economy with it. And so the question then is, what do we do about it, right? And I do believe this is one of the most critical issues for Americans to understand. I believe it's one of the most important institutions that evildoers are using to undermine our liberty, our sovereignty, our prosperity, and, of course, even our values and our moral systems, along with the so-called public education system. I believe this is maybe a close second.
So, friends, we're going to walk through what Alex has just said here. And, Alex, prior to the Federal Reserve, was there not a central bank? I mean, there was the first bank in the United States. I believe it was the urging of Alexander Hamilton that set this up.
Yeah, so Alexander Hamilton was an advocate of a central bank. Some of the founding fathers very vehemently disagreed with the idea. In fact, some of them argued that it was unconstitutional. Only Congress had the power to coin money. They did not have the power to delegate that to some other institution. But Alexander Hamilton won out in that first battle. The first Bank of the United States did not last very long. The central bank system was resurrected with the second Bank of the United States. And, of course, Andrew Jackson famously killed that. And the United States existed without a central bank for generations. And in fact, this was one of our most prosperous periods, one of the most prosperous periods in our history. And we existed quite fine without a central bank. But one thing that I think is important to point out, Jim, is that the First Bank of the United States and the Second Bank of the United States were very, very different creatures to what we're dealing with here with the Federal Reserve. They were not creating money out of nothing. They were not charging interest on money that they created out of nothing. They were not setting interest rates for the American economy. Interest rates are the most important price in the economy. The previous central banks that we had did not set interest rates. So the Federal Reserve is very unique in the history of central banks of the United States, and I would argue it is unbelievably dangerous to our future.
So how did we get to this Federal Reserve? If you could go back to its origins, take us back to, the year around 1913 and leading up to that, and what is the genesis of the Federal Reserve?
So there's a really interesting history here, and it almost sounds unbelievable until you do the research yourself and realize it's indisputable. So in 1910, a group of some of the most powerful industrialists and mega bankers and their pet politicians had a secret meeting on an island not too far from where I live. It's called Jekyll Island. And this incredible story is told in a book that you and I have discussed, Jim, called The Creature from Jekyll Island.
Mm-hmm.
It was written by G. Edward Griffin, just absolutely legendary individual. He's been sounding the alarm about a lot of these things going clear back to the 1960s. And they met on this island. There were some of the big bankers, as I mentioned, Rockefeller interest, Morgan interest, Schiff interest. They brought with them Senator Nelson Aldrich, who had married into the Rockefeller dynasty. And they came up with this idea that they wanted to take control of the money in the United States. And there was still kind of an uproar. We had a kind of a minor banking panic in 1907 that was instigated by the major banking interests, a lot of them with strong ties to Europe. And so they wanted to take this opportunity to seize total control of the nation's money system. So they actually met on this island, and they wrote what eventually became the Federal Reserve Act. And it was really interesting. They actually sold it to the American people as a tool to rein in the bankers. Mm-hmm. It was they told Americans, hey, this bill is what's going to be used to rein in the banks that are abusing Americans. Of course, it did the exact opposite. It gave them total, complete, and unfettered control over our money, over our monetary system, over our economy. But that's the genesis. And if you go to the Jekyll Island today, I've been there several times, the government actually has signs all over the island that this is where the secret meeting took place, where they came up with the Federal Reserve Act. So none of this history is in dispute. It's just unfortunately not very well known.
Well, and I find that interesting. I mean, even the naming of this and what their stated purpose was, and all I could have go through my mind here, Alex, was like the Affordable Care Act or the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, these things did just the opposite, and what you're saying that this also did just the opposite.
That's exactly right. Another one that comes to mind I was just looking at this morning, the Respect for Marriage Act, where Congress enshrined so-called homosexual marriage into federal law and called it the Respect for Marriage Act. So it's very typical of what they do, right? They call the non-federal bank with no reserves, they call it the Federal Reserve, right? It's very typical of how Washington, D.C. operates. And frankly, if a private business were to do these things, if you or I were to do these things, Jim, we would be hauled off to jail for fraud. But when politicians do it, when bureaucrats do it, they call it politics.
So who authorized the Federal Reserve then?
Well, Congress voted on it in a very suspicious vote right before the Christmas break. A lot of people weren't even there. And then Woodrow Wilson, who was basically a creature of these special interests, signed it into law. And there are reports that before his death, he deeply regretted what he had done, that he understood that he had been selling out his country and that he had now placed its future in the hands of an unaccountable banking cabal. But, those were really the key players. But, of course, as I mentioned, it was really the private banks with their allies among the European private banks that led this whole process. The politicians were either just kind of duped or bribed into putting their stamp of approval on it. And then, of course, Woodrow Wilson famously signed it into law the very same year that we got the income tax, by the way, and that was not a coincidence.
Wow. So we have the federal government. They don't own the Federal Reserve. You say private banks do?
It sounds too incredible, Jim, to believe. And when I first heard it, it sounded too incredible to believe, so I didn't believe it. I was in journalism school. I was a young journalist. I was writing for some local publications and became very curious about this. And I had learned in journalism school how to go about verifying whether things are true or not. So I called up the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, which was the closest bank to me. And I said, excuse me, Alex Newman, I'm working on an article. Who owns you?
Mm-hmm.
And I expected them to say, don't be silly. I mean, we're a federal agency. Nobody owns us. The American people owns us. And no, to my surprise, they put me through to their public affairs spokesman, and he gave me the whole rundown. He said, oh, well, actually, we're owned by our shareholders. Our shareholders are the private banks in our region, and we pay them dividends, and they select our officers, and they make the key decisions here. And wait, could you repeat that? And it turns out each of the Federal Reserve banks, each of the regional Fed banks, there's 12 of them, is owned and controlled by its member banks, which are the banks in the region which own stock, which own shares in that Federal Reserve Bank. And again, they are paid dividends. They select the officers for these corporations. And then when the presidents, the regional heads of each of these Federal Reserve banks get together with what's called the Board of Governors, and some of those are appointed by the president from a list given to him by the bankers, then they get together through the Federal Open Market Committee, and they start making some of these key decisions that apply on a national basis.
Now, you had mentioned as these mega bankers got together and had this meeting on Jekyll Island that one of their goals was, they wanted to take control of the nation's money supply. Did that happen?
That's exactly what happened. And it was a gradual process, Jim. I mean, in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act that they passed was very different than the Federal Reserve system that exists today, because there's been a series of amendments to that legislation over the decades. But what they did was they allowed the camel's nose under the tent. They set up the system. They put it in place. Now, and I want to remind people, when this happened, gold still underpinned the U.S. dollar, right? It wasn't like the Federal Reserve could just willy-nilly wake up tomorrow and print $10 trillion if they didn't have the gold to back it up. It took decades before they felt confident enough to say, hey, we're actually going to confiscate all your gold. We're going to, and then finally by 1971, completely sever any and all links between the dollar and gold. But the genesis of this in 1913, it laid the foundation for this monstrous institution that was built on top of it. And again, took a lot of amendments, but what was set up in 1913 was the beginning of the end when it came to sound, honest money in this country. And without sound, honest money, you cannot have a sound, honest economy.
So what is your relation to the U.S. Treasury?
Well, they give some of their profits to the U.S. Treasury, but essentially it's a borrower-lender relationship. And we know what the Bible says about that. The borrower is slave to the lender.
Right. Well,
the Treasury is the borrower. The Federal Reserve is the lender. And that sounds crazy to people because it is crazy. But the way it works is if the Treasury needs money, which the Treasury always needs money, it's $40 trillion in debt right now, not including the $150 trillion that they have in unfunded liabilities, which they have no way to pay. They need money. They say, where are we going to get money from? Well, we're going to sell bonds. So they create some bonds. Let's just say they need $100 billion. They print a bond for $100 billion. They promise to pay 5% interest on it. The Federal Reserve comes in and says, oh, that's a nice bond. We will purchase it from you for $100 billion. So somebody at the Federal Reserve types in $100 billion into a computer system. Poof, $100 billion comes into existence. They loan it to the U.S. Treasury. The Treasury spends that money out into the economy. They pay their workers. They pay the, whatever, food stamps, all the different things the federal government does, the weapons contractors, the people studying shrimp on treadmills, the people doing gender studies in Pakistan, all the rest of it. And then the bill has to come due, right? Somebody's got to pay that bond back. It's essentially an IOU. So then the federal government, through the IRS, which is part of the Treasury, starts collecting money from Americans through income taxes and other taxes, and then pays back the Federal Reserve with interest.
Wow, friends, that's quite a cycle, and we're going to delve more into this and also look at solutions to this, so stay with us. It's an educational time today on Crosstalk, the Federal Reserve, what you need to know. Back in a minute.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, president of the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, did plants evolve?
Chris, according to evolution, both plants and animals evolved from an original single-cell organism which itself came from non-living chemicals. If you look in a book on plant evolution, you'll see many references to plants changing into other types. But when you look for the evidence, you'll be disappointed. Now, there is a lot of evidence that plants have varied over the years, but did they evolve from something else? We have lots of different kinds of algae and ferns and flowering plants, but no clue that any of these basic categories evolved from another. Each were created separately, just like it says in Scripture. In Genesis, we read that God created each basic type after their kind, not by changing one kind into another. Face it, Chris, evolution didn't happen. Now creation, that happened. And we read about that when we go back to Genesis.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. This is Chris O'Brien. Thanks for tuning in.
The Federal Reserve, what you need to know. Alex Newman is with us today. He is the founder and CEO of Liberty Sentinel, and also writes for the New American, senior editor there. Alex, before we continue on, both of these organizations, your personal Liberty Sentinel as well as the New American, through the years they have produced many, many documents and videos and recordings concerning the Federal Reserve. People can have access to these as well.
Yeah, and we sure appreciate people connecting with us and staying informed on this. It's why we do what we do, is to try to keep the American people informed. So I would encourage people, if you go to Liberty Sentinel, SENTINEL.org, you can sign up for our free newsletter there. We send out usually 2 to 3 per week, and then with all the latest information, news from a biblical perspective. And then at the New American, if people go to thenewamerican.com, I would highly encourage people to get a subscription to the print magazine. I don't know of any print publication in the country that does as much good work on the issues that really, really matter. So that's all at thenewamerican.com, libertysentinel.org, and I would encourage people to try to stay well informed, and these are two of the very, very good places where people can get that information.
And friends, today, again, that's libertysentinel.org and thenewamerican.com. Alex Newman is with us today, and we're talking about the Federal Reserve, what you need to know. And Alex, I believe that, from the outset that the Federal Reserve had this mandate to preserve the value of the U.S. dollar, but don't we see the value of the dollar lessening and lessening?
Yes, and that's been going on in perpetuity. I mean, the dollar has lost probably over 99% of its value since we first started with this Federal Reserve system. The loss of purchasing power has accelerated very, very dramatically in recent years. And, you can see that in the price of gold, right? When the Federal Reserve was created, an ounce of gold was somewhere in the neighborhood of $20. Today, an ounce of gold is upward of $3,500 once you pay for the premium. And that's not because the value of gold went up. In fact, the value of gold is around the same as what it's always been. You can still buy a similar amount of food, similar amount of goods, houses, etc. What has happened here is that the purchasing power of the dollar has been completely eliminated, and it's not some mysterious force. It's not that the value of the dollar has just disappeared into thin air. It's that somebody has taken that from you. It's a far more sophisticated way of taking your money. It's a little bit different than traditional taxation, where they just say you either give us the money or we put you in jail. It's much more surreptitious because they don't tell you that it's happening. But it is essentially a massive tax, and it's being used to fund the welfare state, the warfare state, and, of course, profits for the mega banks.
So you've talked about gold. Didn't President Nixon, wasn't he the one that removed the gold backing of the dollar? Or
yes,
payment to the nations?
Who severed that last little link. But what we had seen over the years was a steady move away from gold. Even prior to the Great Depression, the Federal Reserve had already started creating far more dollars than they had gold to justify. That was a very interesting thing, and that's one of the ways they caused the Great Depression. But in the intervening years, you had FDR basically confiscate everybody's gold during the Great Depression, using the Great Depression as a pretext, and then they massively revalued it. They basically cut the value of gold in terms of dollars in half, or basically took half of everybody's money. And then, little by little, they weakened that link, and they weakened that link more, until by 1971, it became very apparent to foreign governments. Foreign governments were the only ones who could still trade in their Federal Reserve notes, their dollars, for gold. Foreign governments started saying, wait a minute, we've got a lot of dollars, and you don't have enough gold to pay back all those dollars at the price that you said you were going to. So the French government and several others started demanding their gold, and Richard Nixon was left with no other option. If he had honored those promises, there would have been no gold left in the United States, and there would have still been a lot of holders of dollars saying, wait, we want our gold too. So he severed that last link in 1971, and we moved toward a kind of a new system where they negotiated with some of the Arab governments to only accept payment for oil in dollars, and that was the birth of the petrodollar. But this is just a long-running scam, Jim.
Let's talk about another term that is often thrown out called quantitative easing. What is that?
It's a very fancy way of saying printing money.
Okay.
And in reality, they don't print the money so much anymore. It's not like they run a printing press and they print up a bunch of bills. It's far more insidious than that. They just sit in front of a computer, they add zeros to it, and presto, they've created new money out of nothing. But quantitative easing, I think they probably had a focus group. They tried to figure out, how can we say this without revealing to the rubes what we're really doing here. And they thought, well, quantitative, nobody wants to ask questions. Nobody wants to seem dumb. Everybody just nods their head. Oh, yeah, quantitative easing. That sounds sophisticated. I'm sure these PhDs in economics know what they're doing. All they're really doing is creating more dollars than there were before, thereby seizing a very significant percentage of your purchasing power. And then they're using that to manipulate the economy, right? When they're doing the quantitative easing, when they're creating a lot of new dollars that didn't exist before, they're then spending them. And they used to be pretty limited in how they could spend them. Mostly they could just buy Treasury bonds, U.S. Treasury bonds, or loan it out on a short-term basis, a very short-term basis to commercial banks. But in recent years, starting back with the 2007 financial crisis, they started going really wild, and they just now buy whatever they want. They created these investment vehicles. Now they buy stocks. They intervene in all kinds of markets. They give bailouts to their friends. It's truly extraordinary. And the reality is, Jim, people don't even know what all is going on there because nobody audits the Federal Reserve.
Wow. And hasn't that been attempted before legislatively for an audit to be done? It seems like Ron Paul was an advocate for that many, many years ago when he was in Congress.
That's exactly right. So Ron Paul, he was always an advocate of ending the Federal Reserve, but he couldn't get his colleagues in Congress to go along with that. So he started saying, well, let's at least audit it, right? He said that would be the first step on the road to ending it, because once people figured out what they were doing through an audit, they would demand an end to this scam. And so he got a bill passed, and unfortunately, the Senate watered it down thanks to Senator Bernie Sanders. They watered it down to the point where it really wasn't even a real audit anymore. But even what we learned in that very, very limited audit was simply astounding, Jim. We found out that they were creating trillions of dollars out of thin air, sending it to their friends, sending it to their own banks, right? The banks that own and control these central banks were receiving massive amounts of bailout funds. So even the little bit that we learned from that very limited audit revealed widespread, I would argue, criminality. They would argue, maybe cronyism would be a less inflammatory term, but essentially they were taking wealth from the American people and using it for their own benefit.
I'm going to get to solutions here in a moment, but you said Bernie Sanders, and, he's gone out on this oligarchy tour, but isn't this indeed like an oligarchy with this?
It is absolutely an oligarchy. And you would think Bernie Sanders, if he truly believed what he says he believes, he would be the first one demanding an end to this system.
Right.
The inflation tax, the effect of the Federal Reserve is essentially to pump never-ending amounts of wealth from the poor, from the middle class, from the average Joe, up to the elites, the people who are most closely connected to the government and to the central bank, which is the billionaires, the millionaires, the mega banks, the shareholders of all these mega banks. So those are the people who benefit. And the people who pay the price are the little people that Bernie Sanders pretends like he's looking out for. So I suspect that either Bernie Sanders doesn't understand this or he doesn't truly believe what he says he believes.
Now, is this group the same ones that are thrusting us toward a central bank digital currency?
Absolutely. There's no question about it. And the leading organization that's pushing for a central bank digital currency is the Bank for International Settlements, which Bill Clinton's mentor, Carroll Quigley, described as the apex of the neo-feudalistic system that they're building at the global level. And so every central bank in the world, I should take that back, 98% of the central banks in the world, according to the last estimate by the Bank for International Settlements and the World Economic Forum, are moving now in the direction of a central bank digital currency. And so the people who control the Bank for International Settlements are essentially the bankers, right? The Bank for International Settlements is often described as the central bank of the central banks. And what I just described with the Federal Reserve is true, generally speaking, for almost all the major central banks of the world. They're privately owned, privately operated by special interests, especially in the banking industry, for the benefit of the special interests and not for the people. So yes, these are the same exact forces that are pushing us toward a central bank digital currency, and beyond that, the digital public infrastructure that they talk about, where Every asset will be tokenized. It will live on an international blockchain ledger that the Bank for International Settlements brags that they are creating. And then the only way to interact with that will be through central bank digital currencies and digital IDs that are in the process of being rolled out around the world. Okay, so that really brings us back. By the way, folks, we're talking with Alex Newman today. Alex is the co-author of numerous books. He is a journalist, senior editor for The New American. He also is founder and CEO of Liberty Sentinel. And this really begs the question then, where do we go from here? Is it too late for the ship to be righted? Is that train too far down the tracks for it to reverse course? What are your thoughts on that? Well, it's like the patient that's bleeding out on the operating table, right? I mean, is it too late to stop the bleeding? Maybe, maybe not. But it's better to stop the bleeding now and do our best than allow the bleeding to continue. And, I think right now we are headed toward a monumental economic crisis that really was created and instigated by the Federal Reserve System. And I think inevitably there's going to be a lot of economic pain. A lot of people are going to have to take haircuts. A lot of people are going to suffer economically as a result of this. But it would be better, it would be preferable to do it sooner rather than later, because the longer we kick the can down the road, the worse the crisis is going to be, the more extreme the responses are going to be, and the more dangerous of a situation that's going to present, not just for Americans, but for the whole world.
That doesn't sound too optimistic.
Unfortunately, I don't know that there's a lot to be optimistic about when it comes to the monetary system. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is a scam piled on top of a scam. They have essentially looted the American economy to the point now where everyone and everything is in debt. And I mean, people should ask themselves, how can it be that the government's $40 trillion in debt and your average consumer is, $50,000, $100,000 in debt, not even including their mortgage, and every company is in massive amounts of debt? How can it be that everybody is in debt? Who are we all in debt to? Right? How can people not ask that? So at some point, the chickens are going to come home to roost, and at that point, when the crisis hits, I think we do have an incredible opportunity to try to rebuild on a solid foundation. But the people who orchestrated and engineered this crisis are going to, as we know very clearly from their own writings and from their own history, they're going to try to use this crisis to consolidate power even more. They'll try to blame the free market and capitalism for the crisis when they themselves created it through basically the opposite of free markets. So we're coming up to a fork in the road that's very dangerous, and we could either go the right way and try to rebuild on a solid foundation, or we could go deeper into the wrong way and essentially give up what's left of our economic freedom, our prosperity, our retirements, et cetera.
Okay, so we're just a minute to the break. We're going to just introduce the topic now and pick up on the other side. But how do we stop the bleeding? The patient's bleeding. How do we stop what steps do we need to take?
Well, I think we're going to have to abolish the Federal Reserve System, and I think that needs to be done very delicately. But there have been bills in Congress for a long time to end the Federal Reserve System. Ron Paul introduced bills to do that, and there are still bills, as I understand right now, to do that. So I think it's important that the discussion move in that direction. And I think one of the really important things that needs to be done is a repudiation of illegitimate debts. Right? If you owe money, if the federal government owes money to the Federal Reserve, and it does, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars, that needs to be repudiated. The Federal Reserve should never have been creating currency out of nothing and using it to buy government debt. That is clearly a fraudulent process. Then you add to that the fraud of interest on top of money they created out of nothing. How can you charge interest on something you created out of nothing? Mm-hmm. First of all, it's unpayable because there is no way to get the interest other than the Federal Reserve creating more money. And I know we're coming to a break right now, but long story short, we've got to abolish this institution. We've got to do it very delicately, and the sooner the better.
Friends, you're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. Alex Newman with us today. The Federal Reserve, what you need to know. And we'll be back with some more discussion. And if you'd like to start getting online right now with your questions, our number is 800-733-9829. We'll be right back.
Year after year, generation after generation, we Americans enjoy the right and opportunity to let our voices be heard through the election of our governing officials. America's republic stands alone among nations. Our founders pledged their life, their fortune, and their sacred honor in the establishment of this nation. Our founding documents have guided this nation and are the substance by which today's laws are judged. Do you own a copy of the Constitution? We expect our leaders and judges to follow it. But do we even know what it says? In a handy pocket-size edition, VCY is making available a booklet containing the U.S. Constitution, all 27 amendments, and the Declaration of Independence. One copy is available for a donation of just $3, 5 copies for $12, or 10 copies for $20 to VCY America. Call 1-800-729-9829.
You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. Alex Newman with us today. Check out his sites at libertysentinel.org. Sentinel, SENTINEL, libertysentinel.org. And just a wide range of articles at thenewamerican.com. And just take advantage of looking at these articles, and there are subscriptions that are available there, etc. Alex, there are regular emails that we get from places like the Better Business Bureau or from other consumer watchdog groups, and with these scam warnings saying, "Hey, watch out for these scams. This one is tailored toward senior citizens. This one is toward young adults or college age," and they will expose the scam as to how it works and what you should be on guard for. How is this scam working with the Federal Reserve? What are they doing?
Well, thank you, Jim. And what I say about the Federal Reserve is it's a scam piled on top of a scam piled on top of a scam, which is hard for people to understand because we're dealing here with one of the most monumental frauds in the history of humanity. But let's start with the basic scam. I mentioned it briefly earlier. They are creating currency out of nothing, right? They're not doing any work. They're just creating currency out of nothing. And this is, of course, currency that can make a real claim against your labor, right? When you see that little dollar bill, it says this note is useful, is a legal tender for all debts, public and private. That means you are obligated by the force of the U.S. government to accept that currency in payment for debts, whether that be for your work or for your goods and services or for your house or whatever it may be. They created it out of nothing, but you actually have to work or supply something to do that. So that's the first step of the scam. Now, the second step of the scam is the interest rate component. Right? Not only are they creating currency out of nothing that then has the ability to purchase real goods and services and to pay for real labor that we have to do, they're then loaning it to the government at interest. And so let's just do a real simple example to kind of illustrate the point. It's obviously a little bit more complex than this. But let's say there's no money in the economy. The Federal Reserve prints $1. They lend it to the U.S. Treasury at 5% interest. So now this dollar starts circulating in the economy. The federal government uses it to pay its employees and to send checks to whoever it owes money to. That money begins to circulate in the economy. But there was a 5% interest rate attached to that bond. That means when the Treasury has to pay back that dollar, they have to pay back $1.05. But here's the problem. There's only one source of dollars. That's the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve has only created $1. So how in the world is the federal government supposed to pay back $1.05 when there's only $1 circulating through the economy? Well, that leads us into the second scam, right? We don't have that 5 cents. That 5 cents does not exist. And so let's say, hypothetically, the Treasury really wants to do the right thing and pay back the debt that it has incurred. They tax every penny in the economy. They've sucked the whole dollar back out of the economy, so the economy has now fallen into a black hole. The Treasury pays that dollar back to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve says, hey, that's nice, thank you. You still owe us 5 cents. Right? Don't you see the terms of this bond? You said you were going to pay us back with 5% interest. Well, what does the Treasury do then? The Treasury can't print money because under the Federal Reserve Act, only the Federal Reserve can create money. They have to then beg the Federal Reserve to create more money and buy another bond. So this is a perpetual cycle. It's like a hamster running in a hamster wheel where the debt just keeps growing bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. We have to keep doing the same thing. And it leads you to a catch-22. If the government pays off all the debt, there's no money left in the economy. The whole thing gets sucked into a black hole, and literally the economy freezes. It comes to a grinding halt. The other alternative is the Federal Reserve keeps creating more and more money, keeps getting lent to the government and then spent into the economy. We see more and more inflation, more and more devaluation of our dollar, less and less purchasing power for the dollars that we're working hard for. So massive, massive scam, right? It is impossible to pay back this money. And then this problem gets compounded once it reaches the commercial banking sector because the commercial banks do much the same thing. The Federal Reserve gives them what's called a reserve requirement ratio, say 10%, depending on the year and who's in charge of the Federal Reserve at that time. That allows commercial banks to create currency out of nothing as long as they have a little bit in reserve. And so this problem then gets compounded through the commercial banking sector. And now there's one more element to the scam that is very, very important to understand. In a free market, prices are set by the forces of supply and demand. The most important single price in the entire economy, without even a close second, is the price of money, which we know as interest rates. We have a group of unelected, technocratic, bureaucratic banking representatives, the people who run the Federal Reserve, determining what interest rates should be. Well, what happens when interest rates or any price is set by something other than the market? Well, massive misallocations of capital, right? If you set prices below where the market would set them, you end up with massive shortages. Producers don't want to produce. Consumers want to buy more than exists, and so you end up with a shortage. If you set prices above where the market would have them, you get the opposite problem. You get a big surplus. When you do this with the most important price in the economy, the price of money, the interest rate, you get what's called the boom and bust cycle. So they set the interest rate too low. What happens? You get a big boom like we saw in the Roaring '20s. And then they say, oh, no, we set the interest rates too low. We need to raise them. Then you get the bust part of the cycle. Whoops, Great Depression, right? This is what's been happening for 100 years. And think of the boom and bust cycle as just a steady heartbeat, pumping wealth from the poor and the middle class in America as they go bankrupt, as they can't pay their mortgages, as they default on their loans. Think of it as a steady heartbeat, pumping the wealth produced by Americans from the middle class, the working class, the everyday Joes, to the uber elites who are ending up with everything. So it's a scam piled on top of a scam piled on top of a scam, Jim. And it's about time that we expose this and stop it, in my opinion.
You're right. And we've got several people lined up. But, Alex, tell us what that system looks like that we could go to. You said, we need to reset what we're doing right now. There may be a collapse, but the sooner we can reset and really build a firm foundation here, what does that look like?
Yeah, that's I think, a really important question, Jim, and I'd love it if people would spend more time thinking about this and talking about this. I don't pretend to have all the answers. In my view, the best system is a free market. I mean, we all know that central planning doesn't work. If you don't believe me, try Cuba, try North Korea, try Zimbabwe, try Cambodia. I mean, try any of the places where they've tried central planning. It never works. Free markets, on the other hand, produce enormous amounts of wealth. And so, in my view, the best thing to do is for the government to just take a hands-off approach. People can use whatever they like as money. It could be gold, it could be silver. That's historically what free people have used around the world. That's what the Bible has described as money, going all the way back to early on, right, in the book of Genesis. Gold is described as money. So that, in my view, is the ideal. Now, there are other very smart people whose views I respect who have other ideas on the solution. Mm-hmm. Some people say, well, let's just shut down the Federal Reserve and let the Treasury Department print money out of nothing, but without charging interest on it. I don't think that's an ideal solution. I think it would certainly be better than what we've got right now. But, my concern then is fallen human beings with the power to create money out of nothing will inevitably abuse it.
Right,
and
right.
So, we'll have a problem there. But there's lots of different ways we could address this. My view is just, the Bible has always described gold and silver as money. Those have served as money throughout almost all of human history for very obvious reasons. They have attributes that are very desirable in a medium of exchange. They're portable, they're scarce, they're divisible, they're durable. I mean, they have every attribute you could want for money, which is historically why people have used them as money. And so, in my view, that's the best solution. But I would encourage people to spend some time thinking about this. And again, to go back to the Word of God. God's Word is filled with insight on this and every other question you could think of.
Our phone number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. We begin with Peter in Phoenix, Arizona. Peter, you're on the air.
Hello, gentlemen. My question is for Alex. It's interesting that you two just talked about a scam upon a scam right before I came on. You probably answered my question in a different way, but my question was, so if there's fraudulent interest on fraudulent monies, how then does the Fed actually and legally pay their regional banks dividends on money that technically doesn't exist?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the very interesting things about the Federal Reserve is that it's able to create money and spend it on whatever it wants with no oversight. So the majority of the money that's going as dividends to the owners of the regional Federal Reserve banks is coming from the profits that they make on the money that they created out of nothing and lent out at interest. That's just very simple. But
Wow.
another unique thing about the Federal Reserve is the Federal Reserve, if let's say they want to buy a nice new painting for the lobby, or they want to build a new building, or whatever the case may be, unlike any agency of the federal government that when they want money they have to go ask Congress for an appropriation, the Federal Reserve just creates the money and spends it. So very, very unique situation there. But, in my opinion, this is absolutely unconscionable, and it is the essence of taxation without representation. It is, in my view, a scam. And good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Peter. Patricia in Fort Worth, Texas, you're on the air. Hello, Patricia. Okay, let's then go to Christine in Racine, Wisconsin. You're on the air.
Hi, Alex. This morning I was talking to my mortgage manager, and it's like you said, talk to people. They don't understand. Nobody, even the bankers, don't understand. She was incredulous when I was telling her some of the things you had said. But the reality is, we have no appetite to tackle this, like you said with Ron Paul and whatnot. But I think the more you get the word out, maybe get on like Joe Rogan. Look, I don't care for that man very much. Or Alex Jones's program. Spread as often and as loudly as you can on those big platforms, because this is so important. This is a criminal enterprise.
Christine, thank you. And Alex is doing that. I mean, he's coming on this program. He's speaking and he writes and he has his podcast and everything that's out there. What we also need is people like you, the grassroots, to take this program, even the link to this program, and to his articles, and cast them out to the sphere of influence that you have as well. It really works hand in hand with that. Alex is certainly doing that, and Christine, we need you to do the same thing.
Amen.
Great, thank you. And Alex, that's what we've got to educate one another in these things.
Absolutely, and thank you, Jim. I couldn't agree with you more. Every one of us has a responsibility to do what we can here. I do what I can. I wrote my first huge investigative piece on the Federal Reserve back in 2010. It was a cover story for the New American Magazine called Fed Manipulations in the Crosshairs, and I would encourage people to check that out for just a basic primer on how this works. It's gotten much worse since then. But, I do go on Alex Jones to discuss these things when he invites me. I do as much media as I can. When I'm invited someplace, I usually go. But we really do depend on everyday people, the folks listening to this right now. Take this, give it to your congressman, give it to your local banker, your financial advisor, to your neighbor. And the more each of us does to get this information out, the harder it will be to keep it silent and keep it suppressed.
Within just a couple of hours, the link to this will be up on our website. Listen over and over again. It's free. You send the link out to others. Put it through your social media channels. Send it out. If you want a hard copy CD, we have a cost for duplication and postage for that. But you can reach out to our switchboard at 800-729-9829. Let's go to Oostburg, Wisconsin. We have Mary calling. Mary, you're on the air.
Hi. I'm just wondering, my husband and I are 60, and with all that's going on that you're talking about here, we unfortunately still have a mortgage and now a home equity loan. Should we be considering cashing in our retirement savings and pay those off so we own everything?
Well, thank you for the question. I have a rule in my life that I never give anyone financial advice of any kind. I'm always happy to share what my wife and I have done. And generally speaking, I regard debt as problematic. The more we can pay down our debts, the better off we will be. The Bible speaks pretty clearly about some of the problems with debt. And so if you have the ability to do that, I think it may be, a wise thing to consider. We didn't have time today to get into the great taking, but there is an effort here, I think, coming up very soon to take it to the next level. And so I think the more people can get out of debt as a general rule, the better off all of us will be.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And we're not able to give financial advice through the program here today, but certainly discussing the problem and a way forward here as to how to right the ship. Alex Newman with us. We'll take more of your calls following the break. You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America.
For the Worldview Report, I'm Brendan House. Our website is worldviewtube.com. Can I ask you a question? Are you under spiritual attack? I hope you are. You may say that's not a very nice thing. But reality is, if you are making a difference for the Great Commission, for Christ, you should be under some kind of spiritual attack. What does that look like in your life? Is someone attacking you, lying about you, slandering you? Are you being discouraged with attacks that are coming out of nowhere, well, you may very well be under spiritual attack. Let me ask you this. Are you speaking truth to people? Real spiritual warfare is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, that says we're to destroy every lofty thing lifted up against the principles of the Lord, taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Real spiritual warfare is setting people free of lies. Now, if you're out there spreading the gospel, proclaiming the gospel, teaching truth, then you're going to come under attack. So today you might say, well, I'm having a bad day. Are you? Are you under spiritual attack? Don't let it get you off course.
Many of you listening here today to Crosstalk may sit back and say, I just never knew that before. I never knew this before. Well, friends, chances are great that you've got friends and those within your circle of influence that, too, have never known this before. And certainly we have the opportunity, whether it be through the hard copy CD or the free email or the links that go out through crosstalkamerica.com. You can sign up daily to get the program sent to you. Just by way of email, but it'll be posted at crosstalkamerica.com and send it out to others. How great it can be for you to inform others on these issues. We have Lily calling next from Tucson, Arizona. Hi, Lily. You're on the air.
Thank you. I have learned so much in this program. My mind is about to burst, but I wanted to make just a couple comments and a question. One was that my son, who did mortgage lending for over 25 years, ended up deciding when he heard from his daughter that mortgage in Latin means death grip, that he wanted to get out of debt, and so he ended up doing some, fixing up a home and selling it and buying land. Mm-hmm. And so basically he has land equity now. But his knowledge in the background of that is something I want to ask you about. Is he anticipates within 20 years or so, when his children are of, income-bearing age, that the greatest problem we face is that the fiat currencies could be called back, and that's owned by China. Did I get that right? I'm kind of like, so that's where if ever China wants to call back the debt that we owe them. But that seems to me bizarre because we have, such contention with them militarily and economically, with the tariffs and all that. Can you give me a better understanding of the fiat currencies and what that all means?
Thank you for your call.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so there's a few things to mention here. Fiat just means by decree or by edict, and so what is meant by the term fiat currency is that our currency has value by decree. Historically, for almost all of human history, currency had value because it had value. Gold had intrinsic value. It was scarce. It was desirable. There was a built-in perpetual demand for gold, and so nobody needed to stick a gun in someone's face and say, you must accept this. People would gladly accept gold at the market price. Fiat currency is different. It has value because a government declares that it has value, and it uses force to enforce that. So the only reason people accept dollars today is because the federal government forces us to accept dollars. That's what it means when you see on the front of your bill, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. It means the government will force you to accept this. It will force you to pay your taxes in it, and therefore it has value by decree. The issue with Communist China is different but related. A lot of the bonds that the Treasury sells, they sell to the Federal Reserve. Some of the bonds that are sold end up in the hands of Communist China. I would say it's a different issue. I do think that a lot of the debts that the U.S. government has incurred are illegitimate, especially all those that have been incurred to the Federal Reserve, which is creating currency out of nothing. The issue with Communist China, separate, right? If we borrowed money from another nation, I think we have an obligation to make good on those debts for the most part, unless, it's odious debt or something like that, if you can prove that there was election fraud and these people incurred a bunch of debts in our name without any legitimacy. But that's a separate issue. So I think the big thing to focus on here today is we have a very unstable, usurious money system that is looting the American people and costing us our prosperity. It is a wicked system, and we should be calling for reforms, and we should be educating ourselves on the nature of this system.
Lily, thank you for the call. We're going to move on. We've got many people on hold right now. We're going next to Colleen, Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. You're on the air.
Hello, thank you. My comments might be a little scattered sounding, and I apologize for that. That's how I'm feeling lately. I especially am thankful for you for your wise words today on quantitative easing. you mentioned something like criminal, and I certainly agree with that. And the most interesting question I heard you ask was, is it enough to stop the bleeding? I kind of symbolize that with, like, well, you said the easement. Like a river, there's a basin, there's a mouth, the banks, and the bed. And is it enough to stop the bleeding? As a previous professional seamstress, as with working with any new articles of fabric, one would stop bleeding into another article of clothing, perhaps, by washing it in vinegar. As a child, I was taught...
Colleen, do you have a question for our guest today? We're very low on time.
Oh, I am so sorry. I guess... I don't know how to form it. I do.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much for the call here today. I apologize. Linda in Sardinia, Ohio, you're on the air.
Hello, this is Linda Hensley from Sardinia, Ohio. Yeah, I was wondering, this has been going on for years and years. Does the presidents that we've had in this United States know of this, or are they in on it?
Great question. Thank you. I think Donald Trump knows more about this than he has said publicly. He has said publicly a few things that indicate that he understands this. He's talked about what they're doing to our dollar. He's talked about the desirability of returning to a gold standard. His father, one of his mentors, I know for a fact, understood this very well. Some of his actions show that he understands this. He tried to appoint a very, very knowledgeable individual, Judy Shelton, to the Federal Reserve Board when the Senate didn't confirm. For obvious reasons, right? You can't have anybody who tells the truth and understands this on the Federal Reserve Board. But I think Trump understands this better than any president in my lifetime. I think most of the presidents have probably not had a good understanding of this, and I believe some of them have absolutely been complicit in this whole fraud.
Thank you, Linda. We're going to squeeze Patricia in, Fort Worth, Texas. You're on the air.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my call. My question is, I am a retired person. What are some practical things that we can do to prepare ourselves to preserve our finances?
Okay. Thank you, Patricia.
Great question, Patricia. And again, as I said at the beginning, I can't give anybody ever financial advice for various reasons. What my wife and I have done, we've tried to diversify. I am a big believer in rural land. I'm a big believer in assets that have real value, that have preserved their value over time. My wife and I have purchased a little bit of gold and silver with our savings. But ultimately, I think keeping Federal Reserve notes is very dangerous. They're losing their purchasing power very rapidly. In my opinion, that I'm not heavily invested in the stock market. I think stocks right now are pretty overvalued. In fact, I think we're in what a lot of economists are calling an everything bubble. So I think it's going to be very challenging for people to try to preserve their wealth over the next years. But I would encourage people to be in prayer about this, go to the Bible and to God for answers. And, probably consult with a well-vetted financial advisor.
Great. And, Alex, you would suggest that people do what they can to get out of debt as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the Bible is so clear about that, and so I would encourage people to try their best to get out of debt if they can.
Patricia, thank you for your call here today. Alex Newman, our guest. Alex, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim. God bless you.
Friends, thanks for joining us on Crosstalk.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the Internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.